Hello. So, if you recall, October was a great reading month for me and was kind of a return to my norm after a pretty lackluster, kind of off-kilter year. Well, November immediately undercut all of that between my birthday and then the election, back to back, may I add. And then work got very busy, so it just was not as robust a reading month as I hoped, which was a little disappointing because there was a lot I wanted to get to. I mean, there's always a lot I want to get to, obviously, but I did have a lot of holdover from October I hoped to slip in, and as we're nearing the end of the year, I have this kind of idea that there are still 2024 releases I want to get to within 2024 proper, but I'm starting to try to let go of a lot of that. So what did I actually get to in November? Let's go through it. I only read 5 books this month, but they were a good 5 and there's still a lot to talk about, though I will admit that we've talked about a lot of them in Feature Fridays already, as I'm trying to get back into the groove of that. But the first one I read, we have not talked about in a Feature Friday. As you may recall, I have been working through the Joanna Shupe backlist that's available in Kindle Unlimited, and I think I've just about exhausted the historical backlist there. I did buy the subsequent books in the series that I started a couple of months ago, but I haven't read those yet. But I did read Sold to the Duke by Joanna Shupe, which is a novella. And like the previous novella I read and we talked about, it's not Gilded Age historical here, as evidenced by the word Duke in the title, though no, that's not accurate because her most recent Gilded Age romance was The Duke Gets Even. So that's not necessarily an indicator, but like the previous novella, this was a little steamier than some of her longer length novels, and I think that that is mostly in perception in relation to how much of the book itself is steam, I think, for me as a reader, because I do think her full novel historicals are steamy. I think that this is just more of the focus here, and the conceit of this is already kind of throwing us into that world, because the conceit of this is we meet Eliza, who used to be from a titled family. I mean, she's still from a titled family, but her brother had passed away and her sister were not taken care of in that inheritance, or the relative that inherited the title basically threw them out onto the street. And Eliza's sister has some health problems and they are in need of ready money. And this leads Eliza to hearing about this auction that she then decides to participate in, where she is auctioning herself. But what she doesn't anticipate is an old friend of her brother's, Lucien, who was also friendly with Eliza when she was younger, being in the audience and recognizing her and pooling his funds with another friend, essentially, who was the reason he was there in the first place, to make sure that he basically secures Eliza so that she doesn't go to this other man that he knows a little bit more about, that would not be a good situation. But Eliza is very dedicated to fulfilling the promise of this arrangement, when Lucien is more like, I protected you from this fate. And so Eliza is kind of pushing this relationship a little bit more, but there is a history there, and there is a kind of idea that Lucien has some guilt in relation to Eliza's death, and then has more guilt when he realizes that he had thought that she was taken care of by the family this entire time and she hasn't been, and so that is at play. Now granted, a lot of those kind of stakes are there to forward some of the steamier bits. And while I did enjoy it, I will say I do think I enjoyed the full-length novels more than the novellas. This is more like, this is something I can get my hands on right now. But I like the pacing of a full-length novel. I think there's more time to, obviously, there's more time to draw out a lot of those relationships. And because those relationship beats have more time to kind of stew, it makes the physical beats that are tied to those relationship beats feel more for me. It's not as divorced from a lot of the emotion, which I think is definitely at play here. Those are tied together, but I think there's more room for that to develop. And because there's more room for that to develop, I can feel the weight of it a little more, especially as the conceit of this one in particular is a lot of bit suspension of disbelief. And so I honestly don't know if the format, like the novella format or the novel format, serves that better for me as a reader. I'm fine doing it, but there is some maneuvering of that I wish there was a little bit more fleshed out. So maybe I'm leaning more toward the full-length novel, but is that just because it's my preference? I don't know. Either way, if you are looking for something on Kindle Unlimited or something quick, this would be a great option. And it's also available, I think, according to the notes in the Rake I'd Like to F anthology. So that is an option. And then from there, I read The Ministry of Time by Kayleen Bradley, which we did talk about in a Feature Friday. I do know that it just won the science fiction category in the Goodreads Choice Awards. I haven't really been paying attention to the awards or the buzz around it beyond the primary round because I came to the conclusion this year based on that video that no, I don't care. And I think a lot of that was also exacerbated by the second round when books like A Sunny Place for Shady People and The Warm Hands and Ghosts were knocked out. And I wasn't surprised. I was a wee bit disappointed, but I was just like indifferent about the whole thing. However, while I haven't been following the conversation around this, clearly I could see there being some contention with this winning the sci-fi category because as I talked about in my review video, the science part was more a device than like baked into it. So we took a lot of the sci-fi elements kind of on faith as much as them being really in focus. I do not think that they were the focus of the book. I think they were more just a device and a kind of speculative angle for the story being told, which worked for me because I was in it for the time travel and the character stuff going on and the kind of thematic explorations more than the scientific angle of it. But within that category, I could see that being kind of contentious because it is a little bit more loose. However, I would argue has Blake Crouch won in the past? I would argue even books like that in that kind of genre of sci-fi is a similar vein in terms of its looseness and kind of taking it on principle in order to serve the action forward plot. This is just more a character forward plot until the end where there's some more action. I don't know. I really enjoyed this book, even as I think that the perspective of the first person narrator wasn't always a sympathetic one, but represented and reflected a lot of thematic explorations in terms of colonialism and the system within this character study, as well as a particular brand of humor it brought to the table that I really appreciated. And again, to reiterate what I said in that video too, anecdotally, it is one of the only books I've read in public this year. Not one of the only books I read in public, but one of the only, if not the only, nope, not the only book I read in public that has caused conversation with strangers. I was reading it while at, admittedly, Culver's, and a woman approached me asking if I was enjoying it on the way out because I did notice me reading the book and kind of perk up, but it was a nice little interaction. And the only like interaction outside of, I would say, a bar where I'm reading that has fostered conversation around a book, because I definitely had conversations at the bar I was reading An Academy for Liars at with other people about that book. And so that is The Ministry of Time, and if you are interested in a deeper exploration or at least a longer exploration, if nothing else, of that book, there is a Feature Friday on it. Now, in relation to longer as well, I did talk more about the book Wicked by Gregory Maguire, which I reread to watch the movie, and I talked about the book in conversation with the musical, the stage musical, and the movie a little bit more in depth. I will say, to circle back to that conversation just for a second, because I saw the movie for the second time yesterday, and I had a whole bit originally in my Wicked video as an example of changes wherein Elphaba does not sing the final bit of Something Bad in the movie, and it leaves it kind of unresolved. However, her character in the movie, I took that as an example or support for the idea that she does believe something like that could happen in Oz. So that is why they left that little bit out. But then I second guessed myself because I listened to the soundtrack, which I hadn't listened to before seeing the movie, and that final bit is in there. And I was like, am I misremembering? But I watched it last night and I didn't hear it again. So I would just like the record to show that I had that thought before and I cut it out of the discussion in case I was wrong. However, the book itself, much different, obviously, than the musical and the movie, which is a lot of what that conversation is about, but it's not about like all of the differences between the two, but more how the storytelling is served by every medium. But like I said there, the book itself is a lot more philosophical, it's a lot more reflective, it is much more of a kind of character study, but at the same time, the characters don't necessarily always feel like driving forces in their life, which is kind of emphasized by the idea of the clock of the time dragon that is throughout the entire book. And the kind of facing of the clock of the time dragon is part of the climax of the book itself. And so it's a much quieter novel in some ways, even if it's still this like epic exploration at the end of the day, because it is a reimagining of the life of the Wicked Witch of the West. However, it is funny in light of the movie when people are talking about going back to the book to get a fix for the story in between the two movies, which is absolutely valid, but the idea that you are not going to spoil the movie for yourself or the Broadway musical for yourself with this book, because in terms of the second part, Act 2, the book deviates so drastically from that. Yes, I would argue part 1 is a little closer, though there are still large changes, but part 2 in particular, there are some major deviations. However, I will be interested because there has been conversation in relation to splitting the movie into two, that they are going to add more of the book back in. And there are only so many ways you can do that with the major plot deviations, I would argue. I don't think it's a very strong argument in the sense that you don't really have to argue much, but how are we going to do that? And I think that part 2, Act 2 might be part of that, other than unless we're counting Galinda's friends in the movie as part of that kind of return to the book in some ways. But again, with those deviations, I don't know exactly what that looks like. I am going to go out on a wild limb and say we're not going to get Lear. Lur? How do you say his name? Regardless, wild stab in the dark, I'm going to say that that is not what we are going to get. But if I have to eat those words in a year, I will be shocked and maybe duly impressed. But again, the book is darker. There is a lot of conversation out there on the internet in light of the movie about how much darker the book is. It is, but at the same time, it is denser as well. And so some of that darkness, the iconic scene at the Philosophy Club, kind of slides in between some of that denser language, I would argue as well. At the same time, there are puppets involved in lewd acts by like page 2 or something. So read at your discretion or give to others to read at your discretion. But yeah, I don't know. The alphabet of the book still feels a little shrouded to me, and we talk about this more in depth in the video, but the idea that the musical and the movie give both Galinda and Elphaba more agency, which makes sense again in relation to the context of the Clock of the Time Dragon in the book and this idea of fate and if you're at the will or if you have free choice, what have you. And so we have these characters that feel like they're just kind of on this path to hit these beats that are going to connect to the story and the finale that we know is happening, but the characters don't necessarily always feel like they're driving their own story. Additionally, in relation to the book, a lot of what we're getting about Elphaba, even in context of it being a reclaiming of her story, we are seeing her still for the predominant portion of the book through the eyes of other characters, even within that third person. Like we start with her parents, and then we get a little bit more from Galinda and from Bach. So even within that third person, we are getting her through the lens of others, which is part of the reason I love the framing device of the musical so much, in the sense of it being Galinda bringing us back into this story, and Elphaba obviously takes over the story and claims her story in relation to this kind of flashback framing device. But I just love how it's all maneuvered. I am a nerd, obviously, about talking about books in conversation with their adaptations and how the changes work, how it serves the story, what different mediums necessitate, and we talk about that more in depth in that video. Then another book that we talked about in a Feature Friday, but The City in Glass by Nevo. As many of you know, if you've been here for a second, I love Nevo, despite the fact that I shamefully still haven't read her Hugo award-winning series. Maybe that should be on my 2025 goal list. But The City in Glass is a fantasy about the life and times of a city through the lens, most specifically, of the demon that kind of runs the city in whatever way, and the angel who smites the city, for lack of a better word, and how this smiting bonds these two, and how the city is rebirthed after. And it's just this really lovely book. Vaux's language is always so exquisite, and I love the way it maneuvers time here as well, because we are looking at things on a very epic scale, especially with this concept of angels and demons and this city being reborn. And so we're looking at large swaths of time, and the way that time is condensed and expanded even within the narrative so seamlessly. There are moments where we are still in a place for a period of time. We almost have the language equivalent of a time lapse. So like watching a plant grow through life cycles while the demon is standing there kind of fostering this. And the way that this explores grief, but also moving on, and this sense of time and progress and society. The original city has a very classical feel to it, and then we're rebuilding, and there are these like references that root it kind of in a time in the past that feels familiar, even within this fantastical world where angels and demons are understood. And there are references to like other mythological things or magic that are just kind of offhand, but kind of keep it outside of real, but also makes us feel, or made me feel as a reader as well, that maybe this is just a kind of past where the wonder is understood and magic and miracles are possible, but also the magic and miracle of this idea of rebirth and renewal, which I think is incredibly pertinent and hits particularly well right now, with lines such as, "Then she put the bitterness away and got to work, because anger could start a thing, but it took endurance and forbearance and patience to finish it." And this idea of progress not being linear, I think, is incredibly important historically. Like, we know that historical context, but I think I'm gonna get philosophical for a second. I apologize. It's so easy to want to conceive of progress being linear, especially within the concept of our own lifetimes, because that is neat and easy and comforting. But there's also comfort in this moment and reflected in this narrative as we are seeing progress be not linear, to remind ourselves that that doesn't mean the progress doesn't happen. And also, I'm not saying like I have taken for granted that progress is linear because I study history, but again, there is comfort in pushing forward and seeing the future as something brighter and better. But I think that this reinforces that the future can still be something brighter and better, or maybe not even better, but different and still good, because there is this kind of exploration here when the demon is thinking on the city of the past that she loved so much, and having to accept that the city that she is rebuilding isn't going to be a recreation of that past, but it's going to be something new, and it's going to be what serves the people living in that city at the time, with the caveats that there's still like plague and war, but also being able to kind of zoom back from them and still feel the immediacy and the devastation of them, but have the more eagle-eyed view of it. I don't know, I really loved it. Again, if you want a more in-depth exploration, check out the Feature Friday on it. Then, in another example of that kind of reading synchronicity, as I was reading The Ministry of Time, which follows a British Cambodian main character and is written by a British Cambodian author, my book club was not reading The Ministry of Time, but we were reading the 2023 Barnes & Noble Book of the Year, The Wager, A Tale of Shipwreck, Mutiny, and Murder by David Grann, which I have already read. I believe I read it last summer. We talked about it, but we were meeting at Chicago's only Cambodian restaurant, Khmer. I apologize if I'm mispronouncing that. And I just want to take this moment. If you are in Chicago, you need to go to this restaurant. It's off Loyola. And I'm not like a big foodie. Like, I like food, but I don't go to a lot of like really, you know, kind of buzzy restaurants necessarily, but I enjoy them. And this is the most excited I've been at a restaurant for a long time. It's relevant because my book club and I went there for our meeting about The Wager because, again, we love a boat book, so I'd been holding this back to recommend to book club, and it was the moment. But we had such a great time. We went to the more small plates version of it so that we could just try a lot of things, and everything was so good. I think I only took a picture of my dessert because I was so focused on eating everything else immediately. And if I remember, I will put it up because it was phenomenal. Everything was phenomenal. So if you can go, please go. They also said they have a happy hour. But while there, we had a very robust conversation about The Wager. I will admit, I did not get The Wager reread in time for book club. I was about halfway through, but I did finish it in November. Book club was in October, but I finished it. I think I may be losing my voice a little bit. I apologize with however it sounds or may sound. I will say I listened to the audiobook again because I already owned it on audio, and a part of me probably should have read it physically. It was a matter of like not wanting or having the time to slip it in physically when I already had the audiobook in my mind. But I wonder if physically I could have charted some of the events a little better. I do think with the second listen, I definitely was able to follow things a lot better. My brain occasionally had trouble keeping track of people, but I think the second listen really helped. Additionally, the first time I read it, listened to it, I was very focused on when we were going to get to the mutiny part. And so there is about almost half of the book, 40% at least, is obviously the lead up to the shipwreck and like the circumstances that got us there. And I definitely think that that framing was more impactful to me the second time when I wasn't just anticipating what I wanted to happen. Though I think that Grant's writing is really great, obviously. But the framing of it was part of why I wanted that, because he starts the book out so evocatively with the idea of these groups returning to England and the fallout of this. And then we go back into how we got there. And I think that that is excellent writing in terms of framing and setting up the story. But then I was obviously anticipating the mutiny and the shipwreck and them being isolated and lost on this island and what exactly was going to happen. But then it maybe wasn't as much of the story as I was expecting. But I definitely appreciated the lead up and the kind of series of unfortunate events that got us there much more this time. Additionally, I just loved discussing this with my book club because we were able to kind of look at these actions and recognize the kind of circumstances and realities. Like, we don't necessarily agree with all of the mutineers' actions, but we also understand what led them to that point. And I also just really appreciated, again, in the second listening, I'm sure I appreciated it the first time as well, but Grant's just kind of unpacking of the history and how the history gets told and who is telling the history and how that is painting everyone, and also that all of this history was existing within the context of the British Empire and the colonialism therein, and how that was shaping a lot of this story as well, especially within the context of the kind of breakdown of this civility that so much of the kind of colonialist mindset relied upon. I just really appreciated his editorial eye in this, in the sense of, okay, this is what one source is saying, this is how they're motivated or what they're motivated by in that portrayal, and being able to also take a more editorial stance on it as well in terms of his own perception of what was going on, while not feeling like that kind of impeded the narrative or broke up the action within this still feeling very much like narrative nonfiction. I mean, it is narrative nonfiction in the sense that this was telling the story of what happened more than analyzing sociologically what happened, if that makes sense. Even if when that did slip in, I very much appreciated it. And of course, this time I appreciated Byron just as much. In fact, the person who I texted immediately upon Byron's appearance the first time I listened to the book is in this book club. So we had a good kind of exploration of Byron in that discussion. And it was just an excellent book club. Like, book club is always fun. I love this book club. But between us being in our element with the boat book that we eventually did talk about, and the fabulous dinner, it was a great book club. With that though, that is all I read in November. I mean, it was good in the sense that there is a lot to discuss with these books. And also, it's probably for the best because I need to wrap this up so that I can run to H Mart with my friend. But that is what I read, and that is what I thought about what I read. And if you've read any of these, I would love to hear your thoughts, as well, of course, as how your November went and what you read. But as always, thank you for hanging out and being interested in what I read. Like and subscribe if you feel like it. Read something good, and yeah, bye.